Hello everyone, and thank you for being here today. I'm Kate Chandler, the Communities and Engagement Project Officer for the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. I was really looking forward to being with you in Roundwood today, but as Deirdre may have explained, I have COVID, so I've recorded this talk for you instead, and I'd like to ask you to please forgive any coughing or spluttering you hear during this talk. I will be pausing for water. I hope you still learn everything you need to know from this talk, but if you do have any further questions afterwards, please direct them to Deirdre, who will send them on to me. The All Ireland Pollinator Plan is a framework bringing together different groups across the island of Ireland to try and create a landscape where pollinators can survive and thrive. And this talk is about what communities can do to help pollinators. It'll be a bit of a whistle-stop tour because we only have half an hour, but I'll go over the top 10 actions you can take, which provide basic principles that can be scaled up or down depending on your community. I'll be referring a lot to our local communities' guidelines for actions for pollinators, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but we will be sending a link for that around afterwards. And I'll be using examples from communities who are implementing these actions particularly well, which hopefully will give you some ideas too. And then for those of you who are in a Tidy Towns group, I will end with a brief look at the Pollinator Award, which is one of the special awards that runs every year. And I just want to say, it cannot be overstated how much incredible work is being done already by community groups up and down the country, which are making a huge difference to pollinators and biodiversity generally. In the scope of this talk, I only have time to refer to a few, as to give every group the full attention they deserve would be a full talk in itself, and the good people of Roundwood Parish Hall will probably be hoovering up around you by the time I'd finished, so I'm only going to refer to a selection today. I'm going to be talking about several resources that can be found on our website, but don't worry about jotting them down because, again, we will be sending the links around later. But I'm going to start with the questions: what are pollinators and what are the problems they face? Pollinators are insects that transfer pollen between plants. They visit flowers for the nectar, which gives them energy, and pollen, which gives them protein. By moving from one flower to another, they transfer pollen between plants and bring about fertilization, which allows the plant to reproduce. On the island of Ireland, most pollination is carried out by wild bees, but also hoverflies, and to a lesser extent, other insects like butterflies and moths. We have 100 wild bee species on the island of Ireland, which is a number that astonished me when I first heard it. One of those is our native honeybee, the Irish black bee. These live in hives and are often kept by beekeepers. We also have 21 bumblebees and 78 solitary bees. These live alone and not in colonies. 1/3 of our bee species in Ireland is threatened with extinction. This is because we have drastically reduced the habitats that provide them with food and safe nesting sites, also because of pests and disease, use of pesticides and climate change. Bumblebees tend to forage within 1 kilometre of their nest, and solitary bees only forage within a few hundred metres, so you can see why it's important to have a regular food source for them throughout the landscape. Most wild bees don't make honey, so they have no way of storing food, and for that reason they're never more than a few days away from starvation, so it's crucial that they have that reliable source of food in the landscape. 78% of our wild plants are pollinated by insects, and that includes trees and flowers. Globally, 100 crops provide 90% of the world's food, and 71 of these are pollinated by bees. So you can see how we need pollinators to ensure the sustainability of our food production. We need them for our own survival. We need them to protect the health of the environment, and of course, these creatures deserve a landscape that supports them for their own sake. The good news is there are very simple actions we can take to help them, and today I'm going to focus on a general overview, and I hope that there will be a few things in here to inspire you. Before I move on to the top 10 actions, this is the local communities guideline that I spoke about, and if you want to start taking action in your community, this is the best place to start. You can find it on our website, pollinators.ie, but as I say, we will send round a link after the talk. So the first action for pollinators is don't mow, let it grow. And if you follow us on social media, you will hear us banging on about this a lot. Reducing mowing is the absolute best thing you can do for pollinators. As we've seen, pollinators are in trouble due to the loss of food and habitat, what we call species-rich grassland, which include a variety of native wildflowers they have evolved alongside. Reducing mowing allows native wildflowers like dandelions, clover, and bird's-foot trefoil to naturally return over time. There are a few options for reducing mowing depending on your space and the different areas in your community. Not every option for mowing will work everywhere. You know yourselves, you need to balance the needs of people as well as biodiversity and safety. So you can pick and choose depending on the needs of that particular area. The first option is a short flowering meadow. This is a cut every 6 weeks starting in mid-April to allow the first dandelions to come up. This allows clover to appear on a rotational basis as well later in the year. Or you could do a long flowering meadow that's cut once a year in September, allowing the seeds to drop in August for next year's flowers. This can take a couple of years to fully establish because at first the soil will be too fertile to support a lot of wildflowers. And this is why some of you might have had problems with wildflower seed establishing in your lawns, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So the crucial thing to remember when establishing a meadow is that you must remove grass cuttings because gradually over time that will reduce the fertility of the soil. It can look a little bit messy in the off season, and that's what some groups have found to be a bigger challenge, is explaining to the wider community why certain areas are being managed in a certain way. So you can do a couple of things like mowing paths through the meadow. Some groups have found success with that to show that it's deliberate management, or use signage to explain that the site is being managed for pollinators. And some examples of this, Kilmaine in Mayo essentially mow their village in 2 halves. So one half of the village is mowed in the first part of the month and the other half is mowed in the second part of the month. So there's always a food source available. There's never just one mow for the whole village where all the flowers are taken out, and you can change this to a 6-week cycle. Also in Castleknock in Dublin, they're trialling a community composting project facilitated by their local authority, where the cuttings from the long meadows is combined with the leaves from Auburn Avenue to yield a source of compost that can be used by the community. And other groups have had success with working with local farmers to remove cuttings, which they then make into hay. And here you can see this is a small area on Auburn Avenue in Castleknock, which is tiny little area, but as you can see, loads of white clover has come up as a result of reducing the mowing there. The second action is to protect and create native hedgerow. This includes hawthorn, which is also called whitethorn, and blackthorn. These flower in spring, providing food for pollinators emerging from hibernation. And yes, bees hibernate, which might come as a surprise to some of you. Queen bees emerge in early spring and they start to look for somewhere to nest. They need access to thousands of flowers a day to raise their first brood, so this early food is vital. If you're managing a hedgerow, allow it to grow in a natural A-shaped profile as opposed to a box shape. And the important thing to remember is that flowers grow on older wood, so avoid cutting annually. Cut on a 3-year rotation at most, which will allow them to flower in spring, although obviously not this time of year because it's against the law. Okay, in Kilkenny then, Tullahoe, some examples of good hedgerow management, working with a local contractor to have them cut as late as possible in December or January, so bramble and ivy are left for wildlife in the autumn. And in Woodstown in Dublin, the Village Residents Association have created a new hedgerow along the M50, connecting existing hedgerows and creating a wildlife corridor, which is something that many of you may have heard of before. Really important way of making sure that different habitats are linked up with each other so wildlife can move safely between areas around the landscape. Number 3 is plant pollinator-friendly trees. Native trees and shrubs like willow, rowan, crabapple and holly support huge numbers of insects, including pollinators. They also flower quite early, so they're important in the same way that hedgerows are. More broadly, they contribute to a healthy climate and biodiversity and support a rich variety of organisms like lichens, birds and mammals. So you can plant a young tree in the autumn or winter or grow them from seed, or you can even allow mature trees to grow in your hedgerow. And there's loads of work happening up and down the country around trees. So, for instance, Monaghan Tidy Towns had about 50 apple trees over 100 years old in one part of the town, which weren't producing fruit. With a maintenance and pruning regime, they're beginning to restore this valuable habitat. Clonmel in Tipperary are enhancing the biodiversity and celebrating their town's heritage as a historical centre of cider production by looking after 160 apple trees in 6 different locations with Clonmel Applefest. And you don't need to plant hundreds of trees, just a few can make a huge difference. So for instance, in Rathgar in Dublin, the Church of the Three Patrons parish worked with the organisation Pocket Forests to plant a few trees in their small biodiversity garden. So if you're not familiar with that organisation, I'd look them up. They plant small groups of trees in small spaces. Number 4 is avoid pesticides, and this is a big one. Pesticides include herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. These are potent chemical cocktails designed to kill various organisms, and one of the best things you can do for pollinators is avoid using them, unless you need to get rid of invasive species like Japanese knotweed. They've been found to kill, harm, and disorientate pollinators, either directly through exposure or indirectly by killing or poisoning their food. Part of this is about changing how we view weeds. Plants that are often regarded as weeds are in fact excellent sources of food for pollinators. On the right here is a summary of 1,800 records that were submitted to us last year of bee sightings, which included what the bee was feeding on at the time of the sighting. So this is essentially a top 10 list of a bee's favourite food. As you can see, dandelions were the most popular by far. There were almost double the number of sightings of dandelions compared to the next plant down, which was knapweed. And even with other factors taken into consideration, this indicates a clear favourite. If you have to remove these plants for safety reasons, for example, avoid chemicals and try to do it by hand, or if that isn't possible, there are some trials being done into alternatives. And again, this is where community groups come in, often leading the way in this area. So Blessington Tidy Towns here in Wicklow have been working with the County Council to have a new weed brusher in the town. This is believed to be the first of its kind used in Ireland, and essentially it's a series of large rotating wire brushes that you can see here looking like something off Doctor Who, which removes unwanted vegetation, keeping footpaths safe for pedestrians but without damaging plants. Other groups have had success with trialling alternative treatments like foam stream, which Ennis Tidy Towns have used very successfully, or saltwater mixes like in Leyland Bridge. The GAA club there have totally eliminated glyphosate in their car park and are now using salt water instead. Other groups use heat treatments or even just manual weeding. And some have used it as an example to run community weeding days. So invite your community to come along and use it as an opportunity to talk about biodiversity measures happening in the area. Number 5 is create nesting habitat. Most bees do not live in beehives. They live in hedgerows, wild areas, dry stone walls, and even in the soil in the ground. So to make a nesting habitat for them can be as simple as scraping back some bare earth, leaving some areas to grow wild, or simply drilling holes in unvarnished wood for solitary bees. We've already seen it's important that bees have a food source near their nest, so choose areas that have flowers nearby. So for example, in Kerry, Castle Gregory has a lot of dry stone walls, which are great nesting habitats. So they protect them with this in mind, and you can see this is a picture here of how they've put a sign up on one of these walls to explain why there are weeds nearby, food sources for the bees. And in Woodstown, there's a great example of how some of the best habitats are ones you might not expect. So they had some dumped earth spoils from building work in their community and scrambler tracks where the earth had been worn back by scramblers. And those are actually excellent habitats for mining bees. So they're protecting them now with that in mind. And they actually, these bare soil areas have seen wildflowers return too. Number 6 is pollinator friendly planting, and this is another big one and something that many of you will be thinking about right now. When you're planning what to plant, try to choose plants that will flower throughout the year. We're finding increasingly with climate change that bees are foraging at times of year they wouldn't have traditionally, so it's more important than ever to provide a food source for them all year round. The key thing to bear in mind when choosing plants is that they must be a good source of nectar and pollen, so that crucial source of energy and protein. And you might be surprised to hear that popular plants like daffodils, tulips and begonias aren't actually great sources of nectar and pollen. Generally, perennials are better than annuals. Bidens and bacopa are great bedding plants for small containers and hanging baskets. Herbs like thyme and rosemary are great choices too. You can plant bulbs like snowdrops, crocus and grape hyacinth in the autumn to provide that crucial source of early food. We have a whole range of different planting guidelines and suggestions on our website, and I can send around lists afterwards. And we'll soon be releasing a top 10 planting list that will have suggestions for a variety of areas and soil types. So lots of work going on around the country in this area. Abbeylee have had a really successful, incredible edible planter project where they grew pollinator friendly herbs in planters and window boxes around the town, and the community were invited to snip away what they wanted. And they also ran a really successful plant swap for pollinator friendly perennials in the community garden. Clonmel again ran a bucket of bulbs initiative with local schools where they gave pollinator friendly bulbs to schools and also seeds to the wider community. And generally there's loads of great planting happening everywhere. Here's a Castle Gregory again using an old kayak as a planter, which looks really nice. And this here on the right is a picture by Peter Cuthbert of a planter in Limerick of Bidens being enjoyed by a bumblebee. So the next 3 things are a few things you need to be a little bit wary of, and they might surprise you. The first of those is think twice about getting a hive of honeybees. And the first thing to say about this is that all pollinators are important and have a role to play. But on the island of Ireland, we have 1 native honeybee species and it is not in decline, thankfully. Most honeybees live in hives and are managed by beekeepers. If we have too many honeybee hives in the landscape, they can compete for food with our wild pollinators who are already struggling. So you should only get a honeybee hive if you want to start a new hobby, but not as an action for biodiversity or to support wild bees. If you're thinking about getting a hive, get in touch with your local beekeeping association to find out how to keep your hive healthy and avoid spreading diseases to wild pollinators. There are loads of groups up and down the country doing excellent work, and they'll be able to give you the best advice. The next one is be careful with wildflower seed mixes. Earlier, I spoke about creating more areas for wildflowers by reducing mowing, and you might have wondered why I didn't suggest sowing wildflower seeds. You might be surprised to hear that actually sowing wildflower seed mixes can damage local biodiversity. Many of these mixes and bee bomb type products have been found to contain non-native species and can inadvertently introduce invasive species, so they will not necessarily result in that all-important species-rich grassland that we spoke about earlier. So approach these with caution. If you do decide to sow these mixes, keep them to garden settings and ensure they are native and of Irish origin. Alternatively, there's a way you can collect and sow seeds from local wildflowers when they drop their seeds in late summer. We have instructions on how to do this that I can send around afterwards, and several groups have already run successful projects harvesting local wildflower seeds and sharing them in their community. Number 9, don't install a large bee hotel. Bee hotels provide nesting habitat for cavity nesting bees, but if they're too big, they can encourage the spread of disease and attract predators. So we recommend avoiding anything bigger than an average size bird box, and keep it away from bird feeders so it's not an easy target from predators. There are lots of other ways to create nesting habitats that I spoke about earlier, and we have guidelines on that too. And last but not least, spread the word. Change happens when word spreads. As community groups, you are in a unique position of being able to bring different parts of your community together. So many groups already have been doing amazing things by working with schools, with businesses, with faith communities, farmers, local authorities, and the wider community generally. In Mayo on the Mullet Peninsula, Bell Mullet Tidy Towns have been working really hard to protect Ireland's rarest bee, the great yellow bumblebee. And they have been running a really successful project called It's All About Bees in the Sea, which is a cross-community project raising awareness of this bee. Other groups have had a lot of success with biodiversity walking trails, linking up habitats across the area. Abbeylee Tidy Towns have run a biodiversity smartphone photography competition on social media, and they release short videos about local biodiversity. And here in Wicklow, Greystones Tidy Towns have run a pollinator pathway project, mapping the different pollinator-friendly areas in the town. And if there are any members of Greystones Tidy Towns here today, I'm sure they can tell you more about that. Lots of groups make great use of social media, notice boards and parish and local newsletters to keep the community informed about what's going on and why certain areas are being managed in a certain way. This is a picture of a community bottle cap mural in Ferns, celebrating local wildlife. So the possibilities are totally endless. Don't be afraid to get creative. Before I finish, I'm going to talk now about the Tidy Towns Local Authority Pollinator Award. So this is part of the annual Tidy Towns Award that encourages groups to implement pollinator-friendly actions as part of the competition. It's administrated by the Heritage Officers and the All Ireland Pollinator Plan at the National Biodiversity Data Centre. Prizes are awarded for large towns or urban centres and villages or small towns in 4 regions, Midlands and East, North West and West, South and Midwest and Southeast. There's also an award for the best overall winner and the best newcomer, who are first-time applicants. Each winning group receives €1,000. The awards are open, they opened yesterday, and the application form is available to download on the Tidy Towns website in the special awards section, and I'm going to take a few minutes now just to go through that application for you. Generally, before I do, I suppose the thing to say about this award is that we really encourage a partnership approach in supporting pollinators. So working together with your local authority and other groups in your area, and particularly a whole town or village approach, as opposed to working in isolated areas, going back to that wildlife corridor idea that we were talking about earlier. This is a much more effective way to help pollinators and biodiversity more generally. So I'm going to quickly take you through the application form for this year. And as I say, you can download it on the website. This is the first page. So you've got all the basic information up here. We ask that it be no more than 3,000 words and only refer to work that has taken place between June 2021 and June 2022. The deadline for submissions is the 10th of June this year. Don't worry about jotting any of this down, because on the second page of this form is a full list of those instructions, so you have all the information you need. First question on the form is essentially, how are you managing pollinator-friendly habitats you already have? And this is number 1 for a reason. It is the most important thing to do as a starting point when you're looking at how to help pollinators in your community. You can see that each question shows how many points you're awarded for each one, and also you can see here that it's linking it's linking right back into the guidelines that I spoke about earlier. So it's telling you which actions it's referring to in those guidelines. So I really would recommend reading those because this whole award is shaped around the suggested actions for pollinators in that document. And that's that document again, which we'll send around afterwards. Number 2 is provide details of the changes you've made to your mowing regimes to help pollinators, and mark the areas on the map here. So I'll talk a little bit more about the map in a minute, but we want to know where you have changed your mowing regimes and what you have done. So whether you're doing a 6-week rotation, if you're making a short flowering meadow, if you're doing a long flowering meadow, and where. 3, provide details of any pollinator-friendly planting that you provide and manage. So name the plants that you used, where are they, again, sort of mark these on the map or tell us where they are on the map. And also if you're doing any projects around gathering native seed, this is where you should put that information to. 4, provide details of nesting habitats that you provide for wild pollinators. Some questions like this one will refer to other guidelines that we have produced, and where that's the case, there will be a link to that, so you can just click through and learn about how to do that particular action. 5, provide details about how you omitted or reduced the use of pesticides. 6, provide details of how you raised public awareness of pollinators in your local area and how you worked in partnership with your local authority and other groups. So this is where you should talk about any workshops or talks you've done, or biodiversity trails, or work with schools, any of that, put that there. 7, are you measuring the impact of your work? This is important, and I didn't have time to touch on it in the main presentation, but you will only know you're making a difference if you're keeping records. So we're asking everyone to add the sites that you're managing for pollinators onto our Actions for Pollinators mapping system, so we can keep track of which areas in the country are being managed for pollinators. You can also do the bumblebee monitoring scheme, which helps us track the abundance of bumblebees and where they are in the country. What are your next 3 priorities or future projects for pollinators? So what do you want to do next? That's number 8. And then coming to the end, just confirm that you have included captioned photographs. We ask all applications to include photos of your work to show us examples of what you've been doing. And finally, the map as well. So an A4 map highlighting locations of all the areas where you're taking pollinator friendly actions. And this just makes it easier for us to see what's happening where the areas are joined up. It doesn't have to be super technical. Just a hand-drawn map would do, even if you could, or a screen grab from Google Maps with labels on it, just as long as it's clear where those areas are and what you're doing there. Okay, so I'm drawing to the end now, and I realise I'm running out of time, so I won't keep you much longer. I know that I have given you a lot of information today. If you're not sure where to start, take a look at this local communities guideline. It is full of really clear information of what you can do, and you can sort of take from that depending on what works best for your community. If you're not sure where to start, the first and most important thing to do is protect what you have. So figure out where the habitats are already. Where are the wildflowers? Where are the hedgerows? Who owns the key to the lawnmower? Who manages the cutting of that hedgerow? And work with those people to protect those areas, because they are already providing a source of food and nesting site for wild bees. So we're going to send around a few links to the guidelines I've mentioned today, but if you want to find out more, there are loads more resources on our website, including planting advice, free signage to download, and we've also got a free course on how to identify and record common Irish bumblebees as well. If you have any specific questions, as I say, please do direct them to Deirdre and she'll forward them on to me. But best of luck with all of your work. And finally, absolutely finally, before I leave you, I want to end with a very short story. A couple of weeks ago, a community group, HX Grow in Harold's Cross, who have been working really hard to improve their neighbourhood for biodiversity in Dublin City, spotted a couple of bees that they had never seen before. They sent us in the photos and we were able to confirm that they had seen a male and a female hairy-footed flower bee. This is the first known sighting of this species in Ireland, and you can see, I don't know if you can see the detail there on the right, but they do actually have hairy feet. So this is our newest bee in Ireland, bringing our total to 100 bees. What a great example of how the efforts of one community can make such a difference. And I will leave you with that. Thank you so much for listening.